very interesting, the connection between religious freedom and positive outcomes for the economy. And as I came across this finding in data that I was looking at when I worked at the Pew Research Center, it struck me that no one else was actually focusing on that. When people approach the topic of religious freedom, they do it usually from a legal point of view or a political science point of view, philosophical point of view, or religious point of view. But I had been measuring religious freedom around the world in each country, and then once you measure something, you can compare it with other measures. And it was in some ways startling that there was such an interesting connection between where religious freedom is practiced, then you have stable societies. What happens when you have a stable society? Well, then you have an environment where people can do normal business. And where you can do normal business, then it sets up innovation. And the other part about innovation and religious freedom is that much of the dynamism in any society comes from its diversity. And so when you have a diversity, and you have minorities in particular, because minorities have this hunger for, proving themselves or getting ahead, and that's a great asset to any society, because they're looking not only in ways for their own faith to have a place, but themselves, and that often translates into creative ideas for how to make society better and how to make a living and do business. Often people will say, well, what about China? It's the big question, because China is known for two things, at least when you think of human rights and the economy. One, the economy is prospering, and two, there's human rights challenges in the country, including high restrictions on religious freedom. That seems to be a contradiction, but when I look at the data, and all the data, not just a snapshot of data, it actually proves this connection. For those that know the history of modern history of China, after the takeover by the communists in 1949, religion was gradually and then drastically shut down. During the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, 1970s, all places of worship were closed. You couldn't find any public expression of religion. Everything went underground, and when that happened, it wasn't just that it went underground and was vibrant. Many people, fell away from faith. So it seemed to be eradicated. But in the reforms of Deng Xiaoping and the openness, you could say China eased up. Not completely at all, but they eased up. Places of worship started to spring up. I was working in China in the early 1980s, and the first churches that, for instance, that came about and reopened, their buildings had been used as stables and warehouses, and so they were clearing this out. And China then let this sort of springtime of religion happen within its own controls, and half of the country now today is practicing a religion. So China has exploded in terms of religious practice and religious activity, still with restrictions on it. So if you think of its economy, what if China still was keeping 600 million people pushed and squashed down in terms of their faith? They wouldn't want to work hard. They would be completely repressed. So I guess what I would argue is that if China would even further loosen its restrictions on religion within the rule of law and within, not harming people, they would see even a greater buy-in from all people in society. The other big country, of course, is India. And India has a vibrant democracy. It has tremendous religious pluralism, large bodies of believers who are, of course, majority Hindu, but has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. Christian populations are large and in many places growing. There's, it's sort of the birth of many world religions. So India itself is an example of this religious diversity and religious dynamism that inspires people, gives people a motivation to live and work. And because of that, the religious situation of India is a potential strength. So at the same time, tensions between religious groups crop up, and you can sometimes see violence and deadly violence occurring. And one of the factors in the research that I've done that helps explain some violence, in fact a large amount of violence that happens, is when the government over-regulates religion. So when a government either takes sides in terms of which religion they favor or not, or when they repress certain groups or put sort of regulations on so that things are operating in religious categories rather than categories for all, that can increase tensions and start a cycle of religious violence. And then when that happens, the possibilities of economic progress are stifled.